Okay, before we go over to the machine to actually sew our binding on, I wanted to talk about how we're going to sew our binding on. So I prefer to hand finish my binding, and what that means is I sew it onto the top of the quilt, and then I fold it over and I hand stitch it to the back of my quilt. Some people will sew it with the machine to the front or the back, fold it over to the other side, and machine stitch it down to the front of the back. It doesn't really matter which way I feel like you do that. The key is to stitch in a specific spot. So for this quilt, I'm going to show you hand stitching the binding after you machine apply it. And then I will have another quilt with different binding that I will show you machine stitching a section of it. So you're gonna keep your quilt to the left of your machine and your foot, and you are going to take your binding and align the raw edges of your binding, they're two together, with the raw edges of your quilt. And you're going to machine stitch 1/4 of an inch all the way down. We are starting on one side. I like to start on the right side of the quilt. I don't know why. I don't start on the top or the bottom. I always start on one side. And you're going to start leaving maybe like an 8-inch tail of your binding. So you can see the top of my quilt is like literally right up there. This is not the exact middle, but I'm going to put my binding down along the edge, but I'm going to actually start sewing my binding down here. So I have a little bit of leeway when it comes to bringing my binding down from the top. I'm going to have to sew those two binding pieces together, and I need a little bit of freedom there. So that's why I leave an 8-inch tail at the beginning. Also, something to think about, and I know people plan this out fully before they start their binding, is when you get to a corner, we have more bulk in the corner. So when we get to the corner of our quilts, we have to stop 1/4 of an inch away from the corner and do a little back stitch, and then we have to fold this in a way to turn that corner, and so it creates some bulk there with the extra fabric. So what we really don't want is we don't want to get to the corner and have a seam of our binding in the corner. That is not fun. So a lot of times when you start on the first side, you can kind of lay out your binding just to make sure. If I was to do that right now, my seam would be super close to the corner there of how I just laid that out. So I can choose to shift it up a little bit, and hopefully from there, based on the size of our quilt, we won't have a seam hit any of our other corners. But it's kind of nice sometimes to get that first one so that you know at least one of your corners is not going to hit a seam on your binding, because it just creates unnecessary bulk. So let's head over to the sewing machine. Okay, we're at the sewing machine. We have our quilt aligned so that the raw edge of the quilt is to the right of the foot. I did put a quick pin in my binding just so I would know where to start my binding and keep that in the one spot. But I'm going to pop down, remember, about 8 inches from the top edge of my binding, and that's where I'm going to start. So what I want to do is I want to sew down this edge, keeping the raw edges. There's 2 of them, remember, because our fabric for our binding is folded in half. And those raw edges we want to keep perfectly aligned with the raw edges of the quilt, and we want to sew at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And I always backstitch at this space anytime other than piecing a quilt block. I'm going to backstitch pretty much any other time. and I'm going to backstitch on the edge of a quilt block too. So just go slow. If you are experiencing any puckers or pulling, see if your machine has a dial or a way to lift your presser foot up a tiny bit, because the pressure of the presser foot may be too much. And worst case, you can do some pins for your binding, attaching it to your quilt, and pins may help a little bit too, because they'll keep things a little bit stretched. Just don't forget to take them out when you come to them so you're not harming your machine at all. And remember, this is the front of your quilt, so you want that 1/4 inch seam allowance to stay as even as possible and a nice smooth straight line, because this is the binding you're going to see on the front of your quilt, and that seam allowance gives you like a really nice clean line. So keep it as straight as possible, go slow, take your time. So when you're getting close to a corner, so here's the corner of our quilt, we want to stop sewing and do a backstitch a 1/4 inch away from the edge. So there's a couple ways you can do that. You can measure a 1/4 inch and have your pins stick out from the edge of your quilt back a little bit, and then just keep your binding on top. And when you get to the point where your needle is coming down at the same spot where your pin is coming out, then you can do a backstitch and then cut your thread there, or you can topically measure as well. And once you get used to what a 1/4 inch looks like, you can eyeball it. But right now I would start with measuring a 1/4 inch on your quilt from the bottom edge here and putting a pin coming out, and that will help you. And when you get close to that pin, just go slow. And once the needle going up and down is at the same level as where the pin is coming out, is when you take the pin, stop, backstitch from there, and don't go past that spot. And then I'm going to cut my thread and lift my foot, and we have our stitches end very nicely at about a 1/4 inch away from this bottom edge here. So now we're going to rotate our quilt to the next side, and we need to do a little fold for that binding. So we get the edge of the binding, the raw edge, to continue down the raw edge of our quilt, but we need to have a nice folded corner here. So we want that kind of to do a really nice 90-degree angle, 90-degree fold, I guess, in the corner, and have this raw edge continue down. And in order to do that, this fold that's happening here, we want that to align with the top edge. Does that make sense? So we have our binding coming down straight. We have the top folded edge of our binding aligning along the top of the last edge. And you can see as I fold it down, it does the same thing over here. It aligns with that edge, and we have kind of this little like angled fold of this excess fabric. It takes a little practice, and it's fine if you don't get it perfect the first time. What we're now going to do is we want to start stitching a 1/4 inch away from this edge and a 1/4 inch down from the top. Essentially, where our stitches ended here, we want to start our stitches right there on the other side of that fold. And you can do that by placing a pin in there, by measuring. I am just going to eyeball it because I've done this hundreds of times. You do want to backstitch, but you want to come forward first and then backstitch to that point and then come forward. We don't want to go behind that point at all. I'll show you that fold once we get going a little bit so I can angle it in front of the camera, how it looks now that it's going to be stitched. And we're going to continue stitching down this side, doing the same thing as last time, aligning our edges. This is that little treble area that I unpicked some stitches. I'm just going to stretch it out so that fabric that's wavy right now is smooth, and then I'm going to pull the binding down to meet the smoothness. Sew across it, and then I can let go of the stretch and it's going to be perfect. We'll show you that too in a minute. You're going to have to keep track of your quilt. It's big and cumbersome, so it doesn't drag or pull, and that won't help your binding at all. I also wanted to move my little binding cake up here. I just wound it around my fingers. If you have a binding spool, that's awesome to use as well. But as I'm using, I have a little bit of a tail hanging off. I'll just kind of turn and unwind a little bit more, and that's how I can kind of keep it organized. So before we get to this corner, let's take a look at our last corner. So we have this spot where we stretched a little bit so that that blue would stretch across, and you can see now it's a nice smooth piece of fabric, no major ripples. And then you see here our starting point for our binding, and we have this kind of angled flap, and that's our start ending point for that binding edge. And this flap can go back and forth to either side so that when we open it up and we push our binding to the back, we're going to make a magical little bias crease right there. That's going to work out perfectly. That is our goal. A little angled fold to finish off the look of that binding, because we're going to angle this and pull it to the back, and we're going to pull the other side to the back, and that is what our binding is going to look like. So let's do that corner again at the next corner. Remember, we want to measure a 1/4 inch in from the edge and put our pin there, and that's on the quilt. And then we are going to sew until our needle is just about at the pin or is right on top of the pin, and then we're going to do a back stitch. And then we'll come forward, and we want to stop at that corner of where that pin is and cut our thread, because we don't want to go past where that 1/4 inch mark is into the corner. Rotate your quilt again. It gets a little bit harder when you're starting a new corner because all the weight of the quilt is on your lap. So now we're going to do that fold again. We're going to bring this edge to a 90-degree fold, aligning those raw edges of your binding with the raw edges of your quilt, and straightening up this edge here to get a really nice fold. Either way, it'll come straight down, and we have that nice kind of flap, and we're going to start sewing on this side of the fold where we ended on the other side. A 1/4 inch from the edge, a 1/4 inch down from the top. There's like a little bump kind of where the fabric underneath is thicker because we've got extra fabric there. And that's kind of what I use as a guide for my needle, knowing where to start and stop. Or you can definitely measure. Okay, so we are getting to the end of our quilt where we started, and we have this 8 inches that we started with, and we need to connect somewhere in this realm of fabric. So we want to leave kind of an 8-inch tail on the next side so that when we get to this point, we're not super close working in these areas. So I'm going to stop 2 squares away and just do a quick back stitch. So we have to connect these 2 ends, right? We have, let's back up a touch here. We have the end coming off where we started. This is where it's sewn down here by my finger at the bottom, and it is coming across the top. And we have this piece that is sewn up here and coming down. So we need to continue sewing those onto the quilt, but we need to make a continuous piece of binding first. So what I like to do, because I do straight binding, is I literally like to stretch those pieces of binding from where they're sewn on across the rest of this quilt top. And I am, where they meet here, we kind of want to angle them up so I can fold them and butt the folds right up next to each other. And then I'm going to cut off from that where they butt up next to each other. I'm going to cut off 1/4 inch. You can kind of also pull them together and have them align and come up vertically from the edge of the quilt. And then I just kind of pull them and trim them so that I can sew across where they butt up next to each other. So that's a straight seam. If you want to do an angled seam, if you're doing the bias, you have to kind of figure out what that looks like the same type of way. I fold over one edge and then I pull my next edge over top of it, making sure this first edge is as smooth as possible from the seam where I'm sewing, where it's sewn on. And basically what we need to do is have these 2 binding edges overlap 2.5 inches, which is the width of the binding. So you can do that one of 2 ways. This is the most common way that people do. They cut off a tail from their binding. They lay their binding overlapped, and where it overlaps, we have our 2 pieces that overlap. This is the top of the piece underneath, and this is the tail of the piece on top. You're going to take that piece that you trimmed off, and this is the width of our binding, 2.5 inches. I'm going to align it. This edge is aligned with the edge of the short piece underneath, and I'm going to trim the top piece down to that same width, using that as a guide for my size. And then I can do my bias binding the same way we did before. But you have the quilt to contend with. Trimmed, we're going to align them just like we did to do the bias seam to connect the binding in the other video when we're sewing the binding end to end. And it's helpful to pin at this point because we have all of that fabric from the quilt to kind of contend with that pulls at the binding. We do need to mark a diagonal line from corner to corner. And if you just follow the direction that I'm doing in this video, you'll have no problem. You do want to be careful of twisting that binding after it's sewn. Sometimes it can twist in the wrong direction. You want to sew on top of that marked line, and if you want to backstitch on either end, that's fine. Then once you have that sewn, just stretch your binding out to make sure it's the right size before you trim off those tails. And then you can trim off the tails of the binding with your scissors or with a rotary cutter, making sure it's 1/4 inch away from the seam. And then we're going to realign our binding edge along the quilt edge and start where we ended sewing the binding on with a back stitch. Continue sewing down the edge of the binding till we get to where we started the binding sewing on and do a little back stitch there, trying to align our stitches to start perfectly on top of the old stitches and end perfectly on top of the old stitches so that that binding stays clean and smooth so that everything is the same size when we fold it over to the back. So what we're going to do next is we're going to take this binding now and wrap it around to the back of the quilt, and we're going to hand stitch it down along the edge. Okay, something you can do, and I'm at the ironing board to demonstrate it. It might help you in the beginning stages of your binding to iron your binding once it's attached to the front. Iron it flat over the front. And when you get to a corner, you can kind of pop that corner to the back, and you can iron it or leave it. Then once you have the whole front bit of binding ironed, you can turn it over to the back and wrap your binding across the edge to the back. And you could iron it again, and you can use some binding clips to clip that into place or use pins. So a binding clip is like a clover clip, and you would just put it there, or you can pin it down, and that preps your binding in the spot to sew it on. If you are sewing your binding by machine, these steps are essential. You're also going to want to prep your corners. So you can see I ironed this, and then you can iron it kind of so it creates this like angle, and then you're going to take this side and just fold it in half, keeping this angle flat and aligned so that when you fold it, that point of that angle makes a nice 45-degree angle there. And I'll show that to you again from a different vantage point so you can see what I'm talking about. But if you happen to be prepping your binding like this with an iron for ironing it, for sewing it in place, doing that with the iron is really easy. So you got those binding clips, and you're just holding the binding in place by popping the binding clips on there. Like I said, essential if you're machine stitching your binding down, not essential if you're hand stitching your binding down, but can be helpful. Okay, we have some hand binding that I'm going to show you how to do. So I use these needles. They're Clover Black Gold applique sharps. I like them. They glide through the fabric smoothly. They're sharp and they're easy to thread. I typically just use Aurifil, the same I use for piecing, but I do double my thread up. So I thread my needle and then I knot the two pieces together at the end. So it's double thread, which I know isn't normal, but the reason I do that is it gives it more strength with two threads. And then I can, when I start my thread in my fabric, I can pull my needle and thread through the loop, and it gives it some more strength. So let's get started here. We have our fabric binding sewn to the front of our quilt, and we are folding it over to the back of our quilt. So I typically sew like this, but it's going to be a little bit tricky doing this with all of the fabric hanging off the end, but we're going to try because this is the way that I prefer to sew, is by having the binding at the top of the quilt and the quilt in my lap. So how I start to bind is, remember we ironed these over, so I just left them there to use for this, so it kind of has the flow. I like to start my needle in the seam allowance of the bindings. This stitch here is the stitch holding the binding on the front. So I do a little dig in with my needle just through these back layers. I pull it almost to the knot, and then I'm going to put my needle through and grab that knot, and then I'm going to just tug all the way down. It gives me a little bit more stability as I am sewing to have my needle and thread started that way. And then I want to fold over my fabric because I want to see, I want to fill up the whole edge of my binding. So my binding is going to come down farther on the back than it does on the front. On the front, we want a perfect 1/4 inch seam allowance. On the back, it's going to pull down farther. And I want to see where that is because I need to pull my needle through to that edge. So I'm going to put my finger there or put a pin to where that edge is. And then I'm going to put my needle in from the selvage edge through the middle layers of my fabrics. It's not coming out the front side. It's only through the middle. And I'm going to pull my needle up right where I left that marker so that my thread is where it needs to be to start. And then I can take my marker out and I can fold it back down, and my thread should be aligned pretty perfectly with the edge of where my binding is. So I go into that binding fold directly, like from the bottom up, and then I angle my needle out and down maybe 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch directly in that fold. I am not whip stitching on top of the fold. I am going in and out of that fold perpendicular so that my stitches are going to be as invisible as possible. And then directly where I come out of the fold is where I'm going to put my needle into the backing, and I'm going to just glide my needle over about 1/4 of an inch through the backing, maybe through the batting, not through the front at all. And I'm going to come back up, keeping it perfectly parallel with the edge of the binding, and pull it tight. And then again, going straight into that fold, rocking it over, and coming out about 1/8 to 1/4 of an inch over. I call this the ladder stitch because it's like going in, like this is the rung of the ladder. And then as you go in and come down, that's the side of the ladder. So your threads are aligning perfectly in the binding and in the backing where they're going in and out. And if you can stack a few on there before you pull your full tail of thread through, that's great as well. But you can maybe see as I do this a little bit faster how I go in the binding exactly perfect with where it's coming out of the backing, and then where I go in the backing exactly perfect with where it's coming out of the binding. So I get a very invisible stitch. And you can see as I pull that up closer, you can barely see those stitches at all. That's my preferred method for binding. It's pretty simple. And I'll load a few stitches on like I'm doing now, and then I'll pull everything through, which sometimes can result in little wiggles or knots in my thread, but that's all part of the game. So you can also use like a thread gloss to gloss your thread so that you don't get any needles or knots or anything in your thread. And I'm using my finger here on the front to kind of feel if that needle is going to come through the front fabric. I don't do tiny binding stitches. I've never actually had a binding pop open of any of our quilts, and just judging from other people who I've given quilts to, I probably wash our quilts way more than anybody else washes their quilts. But I think it's because I use 2 strands of thread as well. So we're coming up onto a corner here, and I did do a nice fold on this side. Remember, we have a nice bias edge that we made because of how we sewed it on, and as I ironed this, I was able to get a pretty nice fold. I want to adjust this because the way that I sew my binding on, I like to have my flat coming from this angle and then my fold over coming from this angle. And you can see there, as I did that I got a nicer fold that way. So you can kind of feel with your fabric what is going to flow the best. So as I'm coming up onto that corner, I want to end my needle right in the ditch there. So I'm going to come up right in that ditch, and then I'm going to start coming up this fold just in the same crease edge of the fold, being careful of my needle holding it together. And then I'm going to just stitch that crease down, going up the 45-degree angle. When I get to the top or close, I'm going to put my needle in and come all the way back down to the ditch and then come out. I'm going to take care of that little knot that happened there. And so I just sewed up that extra long bias there, and I came up out of this little corner. I'm going to go into the backing fabric on the corner and just come up not too far over for my first stitch coming this way. Oops. See, I am getting a few little knots here, but that's okay. They're coming out pretty easily. And then I'm going to continue along my next side. We'll also talk about machine stitching some binding down this back edge as well. Okay, as we get to the end of some thread on our needle, we need to finish off our thread so that we can bury it nicely underneath our binding, and then we can start our next one. So what I'm going to do is I want my thread to come out of my binding, and then I'm going to do one more stitch attaching it to the backing and bring that needle up into the dead space underneath. So my thread is coming out of my binding. I'm going to put it in just like if I was doing a stitch to do my next stitch for my binding, but instead of coming up 1/4 of an inch away, I'm going to put my needle in and I'm going to pull my needle up into the seam allowance of the fabric, making sure my needle is not coming through on the front first. And then I'm going to pull that thread all the way up. It's now coming out of the seam allowance area. I'm going to pull it to tighten those threads so that that binding stays nice and tight and looks good. And then I'm going to do just a quick stitch with a knot. As I come up, I'm coming in between my loop to knot it. And I'm just going to let this, this extra thread hang out here in the binding. And then there's really no waste. And I can clip it up here. Okay, I have my next needle doubled thread. I'm going to pull back the binding, and somewhere where I pulled it up, and from this I'm going to do another knot, pulling my thread through and looping it through for the knot and pulling it taut. And then from the seam allowance, I'm going to glide my needle in through the layers, going through that level of stitches, keeping it in the middle. And I want to pull my needle back up along the edge of my binding before that last stitch. So in between the last 2 stitches, I want to pull my needle back up there. And then it's in the right spot for the edge of the binding. I can just, because it's coming out of the backing, I can just go in and do a stitch and then continue down this row of binding. But yeah, that's how I would restart my next thread and needle, and then there's like no transition there because of how we started it inside the binding.